Thank you so much, Volker, for the invitation and for the very generous introduction. I think you have a wonderful group and you've been doing a lot of exciting research. So it's really nice for me this way to actually get to meet everybody, and hopefully we'll have a great discussion afterwards. And I can see that some old friends as well joining the call, and nice to see you as well. So. Yes, I've got this book out, and it's basically a summary of or an argument developed in the back of over 6 years of research by my group here in Oxford. I'm not going to try to cram everything about the book into this talk, but I'll talk about some of the fundamental issues that the book tackles with in the first few chapters. And namely the idea that digital platforms are controlled by essentially what could be characterized as autocrats, and what to do about that. And now I think a lot of you, probably like me, you are on Twitter, and this issue has become very topical recently and very sort of visible because of Mr. Musk's takeover of Twitter. And even though Twitter was always a quote unquote autocracy in the sense that the rules were set by the company, the way that Mr. Musk does it, very sort of single-handedly coming up with new rules as he goes, that just makes it very obvious and visible to us. And maybe why don't we sort of launch into my presentation at this point. This is well, that's the cover of the book, and this is something I played around with DALL-E, and this is a prompt of a software engineer sitting on a throne in the style of Caravaggio. So so we've got this situation where it's not just Twitter and Musk, but also a lot of other platforms that all the platforms that we are now increasingly relying on in our daily lives, that are controlled by a very small group of people. I'm an economic sociologist, so I focus especially on marketplaces, on economic platforms rather than social media platforms. But I think in a certain fundamental level, the issues are really the same. So Amazon's empire has come to be called such already by other people as well. And Amazon and these other emperors, they used their power not just to create opportunities and create marketplaces, but also to then extract value from those marketplaces, to extract rents and to twist the rules to favor themselves. This is a quote by an Amazon marketplace seller in the book, whose business got essentially taken over by Amazon as soon as it became successful. Another example that I'm sure you're well aware of, Apple App Store, great marketplace. I'm from Finland originally, so very important for the Finnish economy in that apps are a big export industry in Finland. But unfortunately, Apple also uses the autocratic power it has over the marketplace to extract rents and twist the rules. You may know the case of Spotify. A couple of years back, Spotify, this music app made in Sweden, the most popular music app by far for many years. When you search the App Store for music, Spotify was always the #1 result. Until one day in 2019, Apple introduced its own competing app on the same marketplace called Apple Music. Next day, Spotify was no longer #1 search result for music. It wasn't even #2 or even #3, but in fact number 23. behind all kinds of apps that had nothing to do with music even. So Apple had just blatantly used its control of the marketplace to disappear a competitor. And so now this has obviously led to a calls for, excuse me, for an alternative. And a lot of people on Twitter now experimenting. They're looking at Mastodon and the Fediverse. I wonder how many of you have, in the wake of recent events, created an account on a Mastodon server. And obviously, the idea with Mastodon and the Fediverse is that instead of having a single platform, a single company in charge of the platform, it's a federated system where multiple organizations own servers, and then those servers synchronize using standard protocols. And that the idea being obviously that then no single party in the network is powerful enough to abuse their position. But as if you're old enough to remember, that's how the entire internet used to work, right? We used to have almost every internet service was either peer-to-peer or federated, and it worked using a standard protocol. For instance, Usenet, which has been sort of afterwards dubbed as the first social media service. Usenet was and is, it's not used much these days, but it still exists. A system which consisted of groups into which people could subscribe to a group, join a group, and then start discussions in those groups on topics ranging from alien visitors to dolphins. This was launched already in 1979, and by late 80s, it had tens of thousands, possibly something around 150,000 active users. So this was really a thing, and as mentioned, it was based on a federated architecture where users would connect to a server, which was often provided by their university or by a private company, and then those servers would synchronize with other servers, and you could access the same network regardless of which server you connected to. And if you weren't happy with your server provider, they tried to extract rents from you, raise the fees too much, or do something, some other nasty stuff, then you could just switch to another server and crucially continue to access the same network and the same friends. And so yeah, this sounds wonderful. So why can't we have more of this? That's essentially where my book starts from. And in particular, there is a segment of the Usenet called the Usenet Marketplace. So this was a set of groups where people posted things for sale, and then other people bid on them to buy them. So it was a sort of early version of eBay. And this is a quote from essentially what you would see when you join the marketplace as a newbie. Allow us to be the first to welcome you to the Usenet Marketplace, where anything and everything changes hands at better than average prices. This was, there were hundreds of thousands of messages posted to the groups that made up the marketplace. So this seemed like a very nice, thriving model of a marketplace. So then, what happened? Why don't we have that anymore? Why do we now have Amazon and eBay and App Store? You could buy software there as well. So it was a sort of, you could also say that it was an early predecessor of the App Store in some ways. Because if you look at so we collected data on messages, different kinds of messages posted, scraped essentially all the messages posted there over the 90s. And what you can see is that the blue bar, the blue line, the number of messages posted into Usenet Marketplace grows nicely together with internet usage. In the 90s, as you remember, internet usage was growing heavily. So Usenet Marketplace is likewise growing, makes sense. But then suddenly in 1996, it starts stagnating and then falling. Something went wrong. One obvious explanation might be that, well, eBay and Amazon were founded in 1995. So maybe competition showed up. But long story short, this isn't really the reason, because actually eBay, for the first 6 months of its existence, it was very, very marginal. It just had a couple of hundred users. And we can see that Usenet Marketplace starts stagnating already well before eBay and Amazon made any sort of impact on the market. And also Amazon was just a bookstore at that point, so it didn't make any, it couldn't make any impact on Usenet Marketplace, where people traded everything from including books, but also software and especially computer parts, even cars, everything you can think of. And so the puzzle is, why did the Usenet Marketplace fail? Why did this decentralized, federated internet that we already had once 30 years ago, why did it fail in the first place? Because if we can't answer that question, why it failed in the first place, then I think it's quite dangerous to just charge into trying it a second time without fully understanding the lessons of the first time, if you see what I mean. And my explanation for what happened draws on economic sociology and institutional economics. And the key to understanding the issue is the problem that is illustrated very nicely by this quote from the Usenet Marketplace FAQ. How can you send him the item? Everyone on the internet was assumed to be male at that time. So how can you send him the item and make sure you get paid? Conversely, how can he be certain that he'll receive the item in good working order? And this is essentially an expression of what in social theory is variously known as the problem of cooperation or the problem of exchange, which is the prisoner's dilemma that results from the fact that, you know, as a buyer and a seller in long distance trade, after you agree to a trade, now you have to send the payment and the seller has to send the goods, and they both hesitate to go first because they're wary of the fact that if the other person doesn't follow through with their promise, then you end up with nothing and the other person ends up with both the goods and the money. And both parties, if they fear this, and they both hesitate to make a move, and no trade happens. So the social optimum would be that both parties cooperate, trade happens, there's gains from trade, but the equilibrium in a single one-shot prisoner's dilemma is that actually no trade happens and the market never takes off in the first place. This is the fundamental problem that essentially has to be solved in some way for market exchange to be possible. And in modern societies, it's ultimately solved by having the state as a top-down coercive authority that forces you to go through with your promises, that enforces contracts and enforces property rights if necessary. Now, of course, we don't resort to the state to resolve every possible dispute, and it would be the transaction cost from doing so would be prohibitive. But ultimately, social order in a modern society is underpinned by the ability of state to enforce contracts, property rights, regulations, and so on. But in this internet economy in the 90s, that was not the case. State agencies were not online yet. They were not online savvy. People were trading across distance, often across borders, and people were anonymous or pseudonymous. So it was a very difficult case for law enforcement. And importantly, there was this, as you know, this whole ideology that was the dominant ideology on parts of the internet those days, which was that we don't need any governments, we don't need any states. In fact, we want to be independent from them and create a new kind of social order. And that ideology was most powerfully expressed by this gentleman, John Perry Barlow, who was a rancher in Wyoming, northwest, or sort of Midwest, northwest US. He was a cattle farmer. He was a very interesting chap, right? And so the second chapter of my book tells his story, but he was an interesting chap. He was a cattle farmer, but a bit of a rebel. He was a lyricist for the Grateful Dead. He took LSD with Timothy Leary, and he was dreaming of some kind of a new social order. And when his friend from Stanford, whose name I now forget, got him a modem and got him online for the first time in the early 80s, he went absolutely wild, and he was like, wow, this is the new humanity's new neural network that we've been looking for. And so he founded the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I co-founded it with some rich Silicon Valley people. And he published a lot, and he published a Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, as you probably know. And so his answer to the question, well, how can we, without the state, how is exchange possible? How can we have an economy? His answer was something like the following. On the net, order emerges from within the social system itself. It is actually practical to do unto others as you would have done unto you. So he's talking about the golden rule, do unto others as you would have done unto you. And he's saying that, not only is it morally the right thing to do, but also practical. What does he mean by that? He also said this: you can hide in cyberspace, but you can't run. If you spit in the soup, you will have to eat some yourself. On the net, what goes around really will come around sooner or later. And basically what he's talking about is the evolution of cooperation, right? Famous study by Robert Axelrod, which showed that when interactions are repeated, when that prisoner's dilemma I showed you is played not just once, but repeatedly, then cooperation can evolve even between selfish agents, even in the absence of any institutions like the state. And so Barlow saw this in his rural community in Wyoming, right? There was he lived in a little community called Pinedale, and there was no police station there. So if your neighbor did you a favor, then you would pay it back by doing a favor to your neighbor. And this sort of reciprocal being good unto others went on for years and years and years. And he could see that their order grew bottom up from the social system itself. And he thought, well, if this is possible in Wyoming, Pinedale, why not in an online community as well? And indeed, this is sort of how things used to work for a while, at least in the 80s and early 90s. There was this thing called netiquette, right? I don't know if anyone remembers netiquette anymore, but if you went online in the early 90s, you were expected to conform to netiquette, which is an unwritten code of conduct, a set of social norms around acceptable standards of behavior, which even universities taught netiquette to people prior to giving them their computing accounts so that they wouldn't misbehave too much. And basically, the idea in the netiquette is not enforced by any authority. There's no internet police that will come and jail you if you break the netiquette, but other people will frown upon you and will reciprocate by being nasty towards you if you break the rules. So the Usenet Marketplace FAQ, the sort of charter of the marketplace, it had all sorts of instructions and rules in it, but it didn't say if you break this rule, then we will punish you, because they couldn't. Instead, they said, well, it's not in your self-interest to break these rules. So if you post an inappropriate article to an inappropriate group, not only will you suffer by not reaching the right audience, but you will also make thousands of potential customers angry. It's in your self-interest to to cooperate, to conform, to be a good player. And for a while, this marketplace based on this sort of social norms, reciprocity, reputation, people's concern for their own good name, it seemed to work. So, in the early part of 90s, we can see that the number of messages essentially triples within a few years' time. But then from 94, 95 onwards, we start seeing, and I've read a lot of messages that were posted, there are hundreds of messages, and we start seeing messages like this. I am one of the victims of the Intellicom scam. I sent a cashier check of $2,000 to the company and got nothing but frustration and headache. And another user said, someone or some authoritative body should really do something about all the scams that are going on in, well, the group for trading memory chips. There is really a huge problem there. And so what we see from our data that we scraped and analyzed is that whereas the blue line, the number of all messages posted to Usenet Marketplace, is going up nicely from 1990 to 1995, the red line, which is the number of messages about scams, people posting about getting scammed, falling victim to fraud, and warning others about it and complaining about the fact, those suddenly start going up even faster. And they peak in 96, and they start falling together with all the other messages as well. The want to buy messages, so people posting I want to buy an item, they also peak in 96 and they already start stagnating in 95, peak in 96, and then start falling. And towards 98, 99, actually most of the messages are just spam at this point. The real traders have left the marketplace. It has disintegrated. And this has happened, the disintegration has happened already before eBay or Amazon had any sort of impact on the market. So what happened? This is a picture from Oxford in September. I promise it's related. So all timers on the internet will know about this, but back in the 80s, the biggest internet service providers, they were universities, right? And every autumn when the new students came in and got their computing accounts, standards of behavior on the internet tended to fall a little bit because these newcomers didn't know yet how to behave. They hadn't yet internalized the netiquette. But then, in a month or so, they were socialized into the rules, or else they left, and order was restored again. Until the September of 1993. I mean, this cycle kept going on for a decade. New users come, order breaks down a bit, they're socialized into the system, everything is fine again. Until the autumn of 1993. That's when the old-timers noticed that something was different from before, because the newcomers, they just kept coming. September passed, the freshers came in, but then October came, November came, and new people just kept coming and joining Usenet and joining Usenet Marketplace. And this just kept going on, and these online communities, they grew into boom towns, and eventually into this one big giant suburb where people no longer knew each other. So what had happened was that the internet boom had started. The internet had gone mainstream. People by the millions were joining the internet, and it wasn't any longer just a rural something comparable to rural community in Wyoming, where everyone knows each other and they're going to treat each other as neighbors. But instead, people became strangers to each other and started to treat each other like a stranger passing another stranger on the street of a mega city. That is to say, they no longer felt any special bond between each other. And this new epoch in old internet folklore came to be known as the September that never ended, or the eternal September. And we are still in the eternal September today. In the 90s, the late 90s, as a result, the internet became notorious for fraud and deception, which it didn't used to be in the 80s. It became notorious for fraud and deception. This is a quote from a seller in the Usenet marketplace. I myself will never deal with anyone on the internet again as far as buying, selling, or trading goods. A Pew Internet survey showed that in 1996, if I remember correctly, 93% of Americans would not give their credit card information to anyone online. And this is very different from today. Internet, like I said, it became notorious for fraud and deception. Your mother would tell you, don't get into strangers' cars and don't buy anything on the internet because it's guaranteed to be a scam. And into this picture, into this chaos, into this anarchy, then companies like eBay and Amazon came and they set up their walled gardens and they said, join our domains. We will lord over them like a Leviathan, but we will also stop every man's war against every man. We will enforce order coercively if necessary. We will monitor you and we will punish the scammers. And that way you will be able to do business. And people in the millions flocked into within the walls of their domains and sought their protection, and trade prospered, and the digital economy grew into unprecedented heights. Later, companies like Apple came and created similar marketplaces for trading digital goods, including apps. So essentially, the thesis is that, these digital giants, they didn't get to power by stealing it. They got to power by founding the city and providing that order that people sought. The decentralized model was wonderful, but it didn't scale. And it, in fact, never has scaled in history. There's, against the background of economic history, there's actually nothing surprising about this, because the emergence of large-scale impersonal markets and economies is always associated with the rise of a central authority, state authority, that can underpin order at scale when people no longer know each other. And this time, the same thing happened here. The internet played out 3,000 years of economic history in a speed run mode in 30 years, and ended up in the same endpoint. Only this time, the Leviathan is not the state, but large technology companies. Now, of course, this now leaves us in the uncomfortable position of having these large tech companies lording over us. And as I pointed out in the beginning, or people like Mr. Musk, and as I pointed out in the beginning, this is hardly a ideal situation, because not only do they provide order, but also abuse their power. And so, rightly so, people are asking what to do about it. And that's the second part of the book, and I don't think I will go into it in detail now, because it'd be great to have a discussion, but just to give you an idea of what I'm all about. I discuss competition regulation, I discuss Digital Markets Act and so on, but there's shortcomings to all these approaches. Instead, what I'm most interested in is the users of these platforms, especially the business users of these platforms, small businesses that use these platforms to make their living, starting to organize and push back against the Leviathan's power. So, for instance, I have a chapter that tells the story of this gentleman, Andrew Gazdecki. He was born in Chicago, very poor, but became an app developer and made some money that way. So created a successful app business. Until one day, suddenly Apple announces, we're making a slight change to the guidelines of our App Store, and actually the business that you do is now illegal. You're not allowed to do it anymore, starting January 1st. And this happens all the time. It was a bit of a power grab because IBM was, which was Apple's partner, was allowed to continue doing the same kind of business that Andrew was doing, but Andrew and other small developers were stopped from doing it. And in a lot of cases like this, then the developers just suck it up and leave. But Andrew wasn't about to do that, so he started organizing the developers, and he managed to create this tremendous campaign that involved a letter writing campaign, people writing an online petition with thousands of people joining in, thousands of small businesses writing about how this is hurting them, this new rule is hurting them. They pulled their contacts together and started pitching tech journalists. They got TechCrunch to write about how Apple is being unfair. They pulled their money and hired a lobbyist to start talking to Congress, and they got a congressman from California to write an open letter to Apple, to Tim Cook, and say this is not good. And this Apple at the time, it was the first trillion-dollar company, possibly the most powerful company on earth. Tim Cook, more powerful in many ways than most heads of state. And yet, ultimately, Apple had to cave in and say, okay, you win, you're right. We will not go ahead with this rule change. You are allowed to continue doing your business. And in other parts of the platform economy, something similar is happening. This is very recent. This is only 2017. And in other parts, it's happening as well. So just this April, 30,000 sellers on Etsy, the crafts online marketplace, went on strike to protest against increasing fees. And they said that this is not a one-time action. They actually started an organization which they call the Indie Sellers Guild, and the idea is that they're going to organize more and more, and their stated purpose is to start pushing back against the tech platform's autocratic power, gain a voice, gain a seat in the table when the rules of the system are being made. And my point is, this is exactly how it played out historically. We talk about digital feudalism. So why don't we look back in history? How did feudalism end? It didn't end with competition regulation. It ended with the burghers, the emerging middle class, the merchants and craftspeople who profited from the growing economy of the Middle Ages. And they used that power, those resources, the networks and the learnings that they gained that way to start to organize and push back against the feudal lord's power, and won for themselves greater and greater say in how the market towns of the era were governed, and ultimately even resulting in lots of autonomous market towns, especially in Germany, which were controlled by the city burghers, not by the feudal lords. And then later, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the working class movement steps in and expands those political rights from the property owning middle class to everyone. But first, there had to be this gradual bourgeois democratic revolution before the wider sort of socialist revolution was possible. And yeah, that's the kind of social theory, bigger story that I'm crafting in the book. This is the table of contents. Part 1 is about the economic institutions of the platform economy, part 2 about the political institutions, and part 3 about the social institutions. But I think this is all I have time to introduce today. I hope you found it interesting. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.